Okay, today I'm speaking to Alex Rosenberg. He is the R. Taylor Cole Professor of Philosophy. He has secondary appointments in biology and the political sciences. He's been a visiting professor of Oxford, California, etc., etc. He has over 200 academic papers, released several books. Some of them, I'll just give you the titles of a few of them so you can go and pick them up. Hume and the Problem with Causation. The Philosophy of Science, a Contemporary Introduction. I've got that one, I really enjoyed that, so I'll put the link below. The Atheist's Guide to Reality, same as, and The Girl from Krakow, that is actually a fiction book, is branching off into that as well. He has a new book coming out, but we'll speak about that at some point. How are you, Alex?
I'm pretty well. It's great to talk to you again.
Yeah. I didn't bore you then, did I, with your really long introduction?
No, I was expecting to hear more.
I was going to say, I'll actually put a few of his awards and things down below. If I would have ventured to try and say them all, I'd be here all day speaking about his awards, his positions, etc. So, Eliminativism Without Tears. This is a paper he did a few years ago. It's a really interesting paper. I read it about a week ago. I'll put the link in the description below. It's on your Duke.edu page. What's the main argument behind that, Alex?
Well, this is an argument against the thesis that cognitive theory, that the psychological theory, is going to vindicate the ordinary, everyday conception of our human actions as the result of beliefs about the environment and the past and the future and desires about how to attain various goals, where those two variables, beliefs and desires, have content. That is, they are, as the philosopher says, propositional attitudes. They contain statements or sentences about what we believe and what we desire. So, for example, it's widely thought that the reason that you're heading down the Seine is because you believe that Paris is the capital of France and you want to get to Paris. Okay, so two sentences, that Paris is the capital of France and that you want to get to Paris, together determine why you're moving in the direction that you're going right now. That's common sense. It's written into biography and autobiography and history. It's the first stab at a scientific theory, whether it's in economics or in social psychology, of what it is that causes us to behave in the way we do. And, of course, it's been with us, this theory, since Homer, since the Iliad and the Odyssey, because that's the theory that enables us to still understand these great works of literature dating back to 1300 BC. But this theory, I argue, is wrong. It's fundamentally mistaken. It's a useful instrument, like many in the history of science, but one that needs to be superseded. And the paper is an attempt to begin to loosen the hold of the grip of this common sense folk psychology on our scientific approach to understanding ourselves.
In the paper, you mentioned structural resemblance theories. Could you expand on that theory? Could you explain it a little bit to me?
Yeah, I can, but I can't say much about it that's very illuminating other than go and start studying the neuroscientific literature. So the idea is this. Naturally, the brain contains information about the environment. And the brain, another part of the brain, contains information about what goals and ends and objectives will make for our survival, our nutrition, our happiness, our avoidance of disease and pain, etc., etc. So there are parts of the brain that, to a first approximation, to a very rough first approximation, respond to the environment and are goal-directed in the way that common sense suggests we are. But how, in fact, do they work if they don't contain thoughts, if they don't contain statements about the world and about our goals? It seems to me that about the only way in which they could do so is if they are something like maps of reality, maps of the way the world is arranged, and maps of the way we want the world to be arranged. But now, to call them maps isn't really helpful because, of course, maps are like statements. We look at them. They have content. A map contains a whole lot more information than any finite number of sentences, but it's still a representation. It's still a picture. It's still something that has to be interpreted as having meaning, as telling us about reality. And it's that aboutness that sentences and maps both depend on to work, and which doesn't exist in the nature of physical reality. One chunk of matter can't be about, intrinsically directed at, or point to another chunk of matter, and that's what common sense requires. There's a word in philosophy, intentionality. Original intentionality is a property of the brain, and the eliminative materialist says that can't exist. Now, let's try to tie that to this physical isomorphism that you asked about. Well, how does the brain accomplish anything that even vaguely looks like original intentionality as being about the world? If you look at what we're learning in neuroscience about the visual cortex, and especially about the neural apparatus of the sensory organs of much simpler animals, whether it's rats or C. elegans or Drosophila, it's very clear already that the way in which they pick up information, the cells of the brain pick up information about the environment, is by being structurally isomorphic to it. That is, having at some level of abstraction the same, mathematically the same structure or shape. Okay? So the same set of neurons lights up when you are located in a particular place. And when you move to another place, a different set of neurons lights up, and those neurons are dedicated to lighting up at those particular positions. And we could read off your location from knowing which neurons have fired. And there's a mathematical equation which expresses a structural, that is to say, a mathematical sameness, isomorphism, sameness of form between the information in your head and your environment. And the ultimate goal of neuroscience has got to be to uncover those computations, to show what that structural isomorphism is. And we're already beginning to see what it is in the peripheral nervous system, and the big job of the next century or two is to see what it is in the central nervous system.
You use the structural resemblance theory to try and answer people that might say eliminativist, reductionist claims of propositional content as self-refuting. They are reductio ad absurdum of themselves. If there's no content, how can you be saying anything which is truthful?
Well, so you've put your finger on what the big issue is for eliminative materialists, for people like Paul Churchland or Patty Churchland or Steve Stitch or me. When faced with a more conventional philosopher of mind, that philosopher of mind says, you contradict yourself out of your own mouth. John Searle would argue in this way. Yeah. You're telling me that you believe that there are no beliefs, and that you're going to provide me evidence in favor of the belief that there are no beliefs, and try to convince me to change my mind. And every sentence in the description of what we eliminativists are attempting to do involves a pragmatic contradiction. And by pragmatic contradiction, I mean something like the statement, I am not here now. Of course I am here now. How could you deny that you were here now? Similarly, how could you assert that there are no beliefs, since you can't assert anything unless you have beliefs? Unless you have beliefs and desires which together generate your verbal behavior, your assertion. Assertion is the expression of belief and desire, and therefore the assertion that you don't have any is a patent contradiction. Now, in a way, this is right. Okay? In a way, this is a serious matter, and as a marker for what we have to do in developing and establishing a coherent eliminative materialist position is to deal with this problem. And when I used the word coherent, I stopped and thought, that's just another example of the kind of terminology which already presupposes the intelligibility of aboutness, of original intentionality, of belief, desire, psychology, that we eliminativists are going to have to find a way around. In the last part of the paper that you mentioned, Eliminativism Without Tears, I try to address this problem, and it's a regrettable fact about other eliminative materialists, like Churchland, for example, that not only don't they address it, but they actually try to avoid it. So if you read this wonderful book that he wrote about 3 or 4 years ago, a capstone of his entire career as an eliminative materialist, Plato's Camera, Churchland gives us a wonderfully accessible approach, introduction to eliminativism, about how to understand how the brain operates without there being any content or aboutness in the brain at all, and how it operates only on the basis of isomorphism. And then when he gets to the last chapter, he just helps himself to meaningful language and derived intentionality without giving us any account of where the intentionality of the language that he says we all speak and understand comes from. And of course, he can't do that consistently, but by doing so, he avoids the evident problem that we need to grapple with of how it is that we can express in language the thesis that language ultimately has no meaning at all, since its meaning, its derived intentionality, comes from the original intentionality accorded by our interpretations. But if there are no interpretations in the head, there's no original and therefore no derived intentionality. I cannot, in good conscience, stand before you and say I've solved this problem, but I at least think that thinking about physical isomorphism as opposed to, say, representational isomorphism as the kind of isomorphism that exists between a map and the terrain that it maps, physical isomorphism is at this point the only tool that I see for affecting the construction of a response to this doctrine. There's one view in philosophy that does respond to this, but both of them are so disreputable that I don't want eliminative materialism to be touched by them, let alone tarred by their brush. And those two views are Rorty and Derrida. So, and you know that you can see if you've read any of Rorty, the affinity between him and Derrida. It's the idea. Derrida is this idea that there's everything is an interpretation, right? There's nothing but interpretation. Every text is an interpretation of every other text. Yeah. And of course, there's this either infinite regress or vicious circle out of which you can't break. And in a way, well, unless we can make some sense out of physical isomorphism, he's right. We're trapped in this intentional circle. And Rorty, of course, thinks that the way out of this intentional circle is some kind of pragmatism. But I, like Churchland and other philosophers of science, are serious about being scientific realists, and we're not going to accept as the rock bottom of our description of the nature of reality some pragmatic epistemology.
You also are quite a large proponent of teleosemantics. Could you please explain to the people listening, just to give them a brief overview of teleosemantics before we get into it?
Well, to say I'm an opponent is...
Not a proponent.
It's true but misleading. It's because I think that the only game in town, the only possible theory that could succeed in vindicating original intentionality and real intentional content is teleosemantics. Teleosemantics is the attempt to apply a Darwinian theory of blind variation and natural selection, or as I prefer to call it, environmental filtration, to the goal-directed teleological character of human thought and of animal cognition generally. It's certainly true of us that we look like completely, deeply purposive organisms. And Darwin, 150 years ago, showed that every appearance of purpose and goal-directedness in nature is really a disguised instance of blind variation and natural selection. If that's true about adaptations as a whole in nature, like the neck of the giraffe, or photosynthesis in the plant, then it's got to be true of us as well and of our cognitive activities. So teleosemantics is the attempt to take seriously the mechanism that Darwin discovered and which philosophers from Larry Wright onwards have called selected effect etiologies, as a way of cashing in the apparent purposiveness of the mind. And in order for this program to work, it's going to have to give us as fine-grained an analysis of various intentional states as our consciousness suggests these intentional states of belief and desire differ from one another, and that grain is a grain given by natural language, by the entire machinery of the semantics and syntax of spoken languages which invade our consciousness and in which we structure in silent speech or symbols floating across our consciousness our cognitive activities. And until and unless we can actually cash all that in for environmentally appropriate neural states, the dream of teleosemantics is going to be unachieved. And I think, along with philosophers like Fodor, that we're not going to be able to succeed in doing that. You're not going to be able to give us fine-grained a description of the mind by the methods of a Darwinian approach as is required. And of course, for Fodor and other opponents of teleosemantics infer from that therefore there must be another and altogether different account of intentional states. And the eliminativist has to do a modus tollens where Fodor does a modus ponens and argue from the failure of the only game in town that could possibly work, teleosemantics, to the conclusion that eliminativism has to be true.
We're speaking about teleosemantics, we're speaking about structural resemblance theories and eliminativism without tears. I guess both of those things lead us on to truth, lead us on to what we could say is a conception of truth where, by your lights, the eliminativist can't accept there being such a thing as truth.
Well, this is why I felt honestly required me to introduce Derrida and Rorty here. The notion of truth as correspondence, some kind of a relationship between propositions and the world and facts, that somehow is conveyed from propositions to the sentences of natural languages that express true propositions, that conception, which is so deeply entrenched that it's hard to reason about anything without it, that conception is obviously one that gives hostage to the fortune of original intentionality. Because if sentences are the vehicles, the concrete vehicles of propositional truth, and sentences which are nothing but noises in the air or inscriptions and ink marks on or pixels on paper or screens, are themselves given their semantic content, their truth or falsity by our interpretation of them, then truth and falsity are ultimately properties of the content of our mental states. And if we don't have mental states with content, we, eliminative materialists, don't have a good account or any account of truth. Now, that looks like a real cul-de-sac in which to seal ourselves in and invite nobody to take us seriously. And this is where the structural isomorphism stuff comes in, because the core idea of truth as correspondence is one that we might somehow try to save, the idea of correspondence as isomorphism, but not isomorphism between something that is interpreted in a certain way, because that's already content and reality, but some purely physical isomorphism that doesn't require interpretation, that exists and obtains in virtue of some mathematically expressible joint realization of the same structural equation. Okay? Now, the next thing you're going to ask me at this point, I'm sure, is, well, now it sounds like your appeal to structural isomorphism as a substitute for truth is going to commit you to some kind of Platonism about mathematics. And Platonism about mathematics is in some respects about as far as one wants to get from scientific realism. And of course, as you will yourself soon find out when you get to Kiel, this problem about the nature of mathematics and its truth, or its obtaining, if I don't use the word true, its obtaining, independent of human thought, is still as much on the front burner of metaphysics as it was when Plato first noticed the problem.
What would stop somebody using justification conditions, let's say contra Kripke and Wittgenstein, to... Well, first of all, I guess the question would have to start with, if we take out the subject I, and then, when I say I apply any sort of mathematical rule, that I is a logical fallacy in that sense. What stops us using justification conditions and indefinitely many mathematical interpretations which one can justify using a certain standard normative rule?
But are you describing a problem or a solution? Because the one thing about mathematics that we're hoping to explain is its univocal truth value, the univocal meaning of mathematical statements. If there are any statements that have univocal meaning and which are unqualifiedly true and which we know to be true, it's the propositions of mathematics. Now, along comes Kripke, and by a series of very cute moves, begins to show us that at least on most available theories of meaning, we can't attach univocal meaning to the truths of mathematics. And it's very clear that in his hands, the payoff to this argument is skepticism about meaning and not skepticism about whether there are mathematical truths. Now, do you want to suggest that maybe there aren't univocal mathematical truths and that we can help ourselves to whichever convenient, I hesitate to use the word interpretation, we want without finding ourselves in any kind of mathematical difficulties? Somebody once said, in the history of philosophy, in the history of the philosophy of mathematics, there are a small number of problems on which the greatest minds in history have lavished attention for 2,500 years with no appreciable progress at all. Right? The amazing thing, of course, is mathematics seems to get by very well without having the slightest idea of what a number is. And it turns out, of course, if Kripke's right, without having the slightest idea of what exactly addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division are.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, what does this tell us? It tells us one of two things. Either the problems that you and I are wrestling with in trying to figure out the nature of mathematical objects and the foundations of mathematical knowledge, that they're all pseudo-problems, right? Or that we've got this phenomenal edifice of knowledge going all the way up to Gödel on the one hand and multivariate calculus differential equations, mathematical analysis, number theory on the other, and we really don't know what we're talking about.
Especially if you bring
Which is it, right? And if you and I get tied up in not trying to figure these matters out, we're no worse off. In fact, we're probably better off than the mathematicians who haven't even noticed these problems, unless they're pseudo problems. Okay, could they be pseudo problems? I don't think so, because when you think about how did Gödel, or for that matter, Frege, or Zermelo and Fraenkel get to their problems about completeness, inconsistency, the axiom of choice, stuff like that without worrying about these problems. So I refuse to accept that they're pseudo-problems, and I refuse to be very embarrassed by the fact that I get tied up in knots trying to figure them out. I've got to get out of here now because I've got to go over to the other side of the campus to meet with one of my students. But I think this is a conversation to be continued.